All right. Hello, everybody. It looks like we're live and ready to go here. So welcome to Conversations with the Council. I am Jenny Bowersfeld. I work for the Lacey Public Affairs Department, and it's been a while since we have hosted an episode. So it's great to be back. I'm honored to be joined by our guest today. With us, we have Councilmember Lenny Greenstein.
Good afternoon.
And Councilmember Malcolm Miller.
Hey.
And our Lacey Police Chief Robert Almada.
Good to see you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for giving us your time this afternoon. And just to those viewers watching, if you are registered through Zoom, please feel free to utilize the live Q&A feature. We will answer your questions as we go. So today we are joined by Chief Almada. As we know, this has been quite the year for all of us as we continue to find ourselves operating in a pandemic and all of the stress and anxiety that brings. Even through these challenges, though, the city has continued to work hard addressing some of the pressing issues that are and needs in our community. And a couple of those being homelessness and some recent changes to policing legislation. So Chief has been gracious enough to join us today and give us a little bit more information on that. We want to use today's conversation to provide updates to these important matters and highlight a few other items as well. As we continue to work on homelessness and all the ways that we have so far and finding solutions and resources, we also recognize the importance of keeping our beautiful city clean and safe. And just a couple of things to mention, we've recently approved a great program referred to as the Rapid Response Cleanup Crew. So this crew is going to be starting shortly. They're going to be assigned to picking up garbage in our public spaces and our city right-of-ways that may have been left over from a homeless camp or whatever that might be. So just a specific group that's going to be really focused on cleaning up those areas, which is great. Also just wanted to mention that we have been working with a contracting company to collect trash along the I-5 corridor that borders Lacey. So as people are driving up and down I-5, hopefully a lot of the trash and things that folks have been seeing will be addressed and cleaned up. So that's another great thing that we've been able to add to our tools. As we have mentioned in the past, we have a great group that has been working, our homelessness work group. They are continuing their work to eventually report to our city council in the findings that they have come up with. And they're still working through that, also kind of navigating through these new COVID restrictions, things like that. But they're doing a great job, and we'll be hearing more from them as time goes. We also have a mobile outreach team, which Chief Almada will give more information on, but this is a great program for our police department that's getting out and working with our homeless community. As I mentioned, new policing legislation that is impacting our community, and Chief Almada will be addressing those as well. And then we'll also just touch base on some recent community outreach efforts. You may have seen our police department out in the community lately. So we'll be highlighting that towards the end of our conversation today. So Chief, if you'd like to start maybe telling us a little bit about the mobile outreach team that has recently started through the police department.
Oh, thank you, Jenny. I appreciate that. So pretty exciting developments we've been having. So through the graciousness of the city council and the fine leadership by our city manager, Scott Spence, we really have had transition in our response to homelessness. As you know, we had some homeless camps popping up in non-Lacey areas, but they were adjacent to Lacey in WSDOT controlled areas, Department of Ecology, those type of areas. And so we entered into agreements with them and created baseline surveys of the folks in those camps and basically created static so folks couldn't be added to the camps. And then we started doing outreach, and we had our homeless navigator with us providing services, and that worked really well. Unfortunately, he had to go back to the military, and we were kind of looking for another reiteration of how we're going to do outreach to our homeless community. And so now we're partnering with Olympic Health and Recovery Services, and we have brought on 4 members. and they are known as our mobile outreach team. And they partner with our community resource unit and go out and contact every single known homeless camp in Lacey every single day and provide services and coordinate entry into those services and really try to find better outcomes for folks and get them out of the homelessness that we find them in these camps. And we've really been quite effective to this point in cutting the baseline from what they were to about half of what they were. You'll notice a lot of the trash issues have been addressed, a lot of the issues that Jenny, a lot of the resources Jenny talked about earlier. So our program's really working well. We brought Mott on this week, mobile outreach team, Mott. And they've already done 94 referrals in this first week. So pretty amazing work with just getting onboarded. This week, I really just anticipated they would get onboarded, but they really kind of jumped to it and started really doing the outreach. So pretty impressive work by them. So very, very happy with how that's turning out. So each Mott team, there's two teams of two. Each team has a licensed clinician and then a peer counselor. So someone who really has a background and can identify with folks experiencing homelessness and provide better outcomes. So pretty excited about that.
That's awesome. That's really encouraging that they have just jumped right in and made such an impact already. That's fantastic.
That's great.
Lenny, so why do you see this mobile outreach team being such a important piece for our community?
I think it's critical that the right people respond to the right types of calls. And as much as that has fallen on police, not only here in Lacey, but pretty much, across the country dealing with this, and they've done, an admirable job. But the reality is our police are not really trained to deal with social issues. That's really not the function and the purpose of our police department. So I think it's great that we're going to have people who are specialized, who are trained, who can actually hopefully help some of these people deal with whatever their issues are. Some have drug addiction issues, mental health issues, whatever it might be, and get them into the services they need, through the coordinated entry. And of course, we'll still have our police there to back them up if they need it, and to make sure we keep them safe, because there is always that concern, right? They're going to be going out there. They're not police. They're not armed. They're not trained to do what police do. Mm-hmm. So we'll have to have the police there to make sure that they stay safe. But it's really exciting, and I think it's going to have very positive outcomes.
Yep. Chief, does the police officer go with them, or does the Mott team members, do they just have like a way to contact them quickly, or how does that work?
So for this first week, and actually the first 2 weeks, our community resource unit officers, Officer Justin Beltran, Officer Jimmy Williams, are accompanying and frankly doing that handshake introduction to frankly all the folks we know in the homeless camps. We're on a first name basis with them. We know the folks, we've developed that relationship, but still, well, like Councilmember Greenstein talked about, there can be that barrier between a law enforcement officer and the role that we fulfill doing law enforcement, and they really, in a social worker that just doesn't have that law enforcement stigma to them. So we're hoping that Mott will actually take over that primary role in being the first in, talking to folks, and will provide that outreach. One of the questions that I saw on the feed was, what does a typical day of the Mott team look like? And they'll get briefed. So officers who contact homeless people during their shift will basically make a list of referrals for the Mott team to go out for that day. We expect to have the Mott team here, 7 days a week. There'll be at least a 2-person team working during the main body of the day for 8 to 10 hours a day. And they're going to go out and do a follow-up on whatever the officers find during their shifts, the previous shift. They'll go and visit every single camp every single day. And it's, when you deal with folks who are experiencing homelessness and in crisis, it's really that repetition that, like, hey, we're here, we're not going away. We're here to help you. And it's the constant being reliable, keeping your promises. I'm here to help you. I'm here to get you into services and help you through to navigate the bureaucracy that can be in social services. That's what builds that level of trust. Because if you've been homeless for a while, you can really get pretty distrustful of the system and get pretty against it, the whole thing, and feel like the whole weight of the world's on your shoulders. And you get pretty distrustful of government and the system, right? So our mobile outreach team will be able to kind of break down some of those barriers and help navigate some of those odds and ends of bureaucracy.
Great. There was a question that just came in that said, will this help us track the demographic of homeless in the city? And could you talk about the follow-up program that will help these families?
Certainly. So one of the things that we require, we've already been doing with our CRU unit is we did a baseline survey of all the folks in the homeless camps and identifying them by name and by relationship. And I mean, there's a whole dynamic that goes into homelessness, frankly, and the relationships between the folks in the camps that come and go and different things, and helping to identify that. Part of the mobile outreach team will be doing, as well as continue to identify folks in the camps and noting their progress as they navigate through the system and get through coordinated entry, is also identifying their outcomes and tracking cases. So officers are really good at going out to a situation, finding a temporary solution and resolving the issue for the day. Our mobile outreach teams, the purpose is actually do case management. And it's not just the day, it's not just the week, it's actually until they're finally into a more successful outcome, which is, weeks, months, maybe even longer down the line. But as they progress through the system from living in a homeless camp to transition housing to a more permanent, stable housing with a more sustainable unit, and providing that social net that they need to have a sustained improved outcome.
Right, which really is the goal. I mean, that is the purpose of this work that you guys are doing. It doesn't do much good to just make contact once or twice and then be gone. So for them to have that support from start to finish is vital. So
our main goal with the mobile outreach team is not to put a Band-Aid on the problem, but to resolve the problem, right, and really find some better long-term outcomes.
Great.
True success for any of these individuals that the team will be working with is to get them into permanent housing, right? Permanent housing, hopefully with a job and the ability to take care of themselves and get the help they need so that they can become more productive and, and more and back into the more norms of society. But that's the end result that you're hoping for. So hopefully, and I believe it will work. I think we're going to see some really good success from this.
Yeah. Councilmember Miller, do you have any thoughts on that, or on this mobile outreach team and the importance for this in our community and in our police department?
Yeah, I have been in favor of it from the beginning. In fact, when we started policing and monitoring, some of these DOT right-of-ways where people are, have made habitats, it was one of those things where I initially spoke with the city manager, said, listen, I want to track, all the efforts and all the spending that we're doing so that we can, have an account of what it is it's costing us to police and monitor state right-of-ways, because we have to, as we pay for those things, I just, and I know the state comes to our, aid, and, we get new roundabouts and we get traffic circles and, diverging diamonds, and the state comes and really helps us out with a lot of funding on a lot of our projects. But at the same time, I wanted to know, what is it costing us to take care of their right of way in a way that, they just simply don't feel that they can do and are leaving it to cities to do. So this was a really welcomed thought and idea, and something that I didn't feel like, even though we did have armed officers showing up there, saying, hey, we're just here to help, and putting the things in place. Sometimes, an armed officer is not the presence that you want to project with people that are, number one, scared of seeing a gun on a hip. Number two, are already down on their luck or having a hard time. I took a homeless guy to lunch, and I said to him, I said, dude, you don't smell like alcohol. You don't appear to be on drugs. Why are you homeless? And he just said simply, he's like, man, I got priced out of my apartment. I can't afford $2,000 a month. And I was like, my God, and so, he had even tried to huddle up with other guys and pay these numbers. And he's like, I can't do it. And so he decided, after he became homeless, that he was going to have to move to another community that just had lower price points for housing. So, I really felt for him, and that was the end of our exchange. We finished our lunch, and I went on my way. He went on his way. But I figured at that point, and he told me, he's like, a lot of us who are homeless, we're not druggies. The drugs are out there in the street. Once you hit the street, the drugs are there waiting on you. But a lot of us are just people who just can't afford to on our skill set, live in this community, live in this society at this point in time. I'm very happy with this program because it puts people out in the community saying, hey, we're not here to police you. We're here to help you.
Yeah.
And so I think this is a really good start, and I've been in support of it from the beginning.
Yeah. Well, and I think you made a good point too, Councilmember Miller, just that I think that our homeless community, having an armed officer could be very intimidating, out approaching them. And so to have this group of people, that are just dressed, are civilians and, coming out and just a friendly face to help them, I think is going to be received really, really well. And it sounds like it already has been. So that's fantastic. Chief, there was a question that came through, I think is a good one, important to address. It says, if I see a homeless person experience a mental health crisis, how do I contact the mobile outreach team? Do they need to be contacted directly, or do they call the police department still?
They're going to call 911 or the non-emergency number for TCOM, and they'll be dispatched through TCOM to go out and take and if they're on duty to go address that issue.
Okay.
And person in mental health crisis, having whatever the issue is. There's lots of folks out there having a non-criminal issue that need help.
Sure.
And that's what our mobile outreach team is there to do.
Great. Well, thank you for sharing the update on that. That a lot of this was even news to me, just with the success that they've already had in the short time that they've been actively working with us. So very exciting stuff. I want to move along, Chief, to our new policing legislation. I know that this is some really important information that you've been trying to get out into the community. You've been attending some different meetings. So we want to give you some time to talk through the changes that you guys have been working through and adapting to, and how that affects our community, and share that information with us.
So it's really a good segue, right? So we've been talking about mobile outreach teams really addressing social problems and relieving police officers, which we have limited police resources, and let them addressing crime-related issues. And that's really what the legislator was talking about this last legislative session. So it was a remote session because of COVID, lasted 105 days, and they had four primary priorities for the session. That was racial justice and equity, COVID, economic recovery, and climate change. And the way they want to address racial justice and equity really is to concentrate on policing. And they decided the way to do that would be to have the law enforcement policy decisions being driven by community voices and not law enforcement voices, which is a little bit of a change. And in the words that we heard, frankly, in law enforcement, they said, we hear you, law enforcement, that's the legislators talking, but we're going to go a different direction. And okay, so we have unified goals. Well, we're about sanctity of life, minimal use of force, proportional use of force, and making sure that folks that are having mental health issues are dealt with humanely and provided mental health resources, not being introduced inappropriately to the criminal justice system. And so we have very unified goals. It just, they introduced 16 legislative bills that kind of went in a different direction than we're used to, frankly, here in Washington. And so we're going to talk about those just kind of briefly, and then talk about the response from the police department on how we're making sure that we're following the legislation. So if we can go to the slides, John, that'd be great. Okay, so let's go to slide 3, if you would, please. Next slide. There we go. All right, so here's the 16 pieces of legislation, pretty dynamic and far-reaching. Talked about tactics, talked about certification for an officer. To be an officer here in the state of Washington, you must be certified through Criminal Justice Training Center. So that's pretty important. And frankly, if you don't follow the guidelines prescribed in law, you get decertified and you cannot be a police officer. So it's a pretty heavy penalty, right? So today we're going to pretty much concentrate on House Bill 1054 and 1310. Next slide, please. So 1054 talks about tactics that police can use. not a lot of big changes here in the city of Lacey. So it says you can't use a chokehold or neck restraint in any circumstance. Well, we don't train that technique, and it's not something we readily use here at the Lacey Police Department, so not a big change. Also prohibited no-knock warrants. That means that when you are serving a search warrant, you have to announce yourself and give the person a chance to answer the door and comply with law enforcement. Well, we've never used no-knock warrants here in the city of Lacey, so really not a big change. Talks about use of tear gas only in certain situations. You have to exhaust all other means that are available and appropriate. Doesn't really identify what exhaust, available, or appropriate means as terms, but we'll get past that. Also, if we're going to use tear gas in a riot situation, here in the city of Lacey, we would require the consent of the mayor before we could use tear gas. So a little bit different, but frankly, not something we routinely deal with here in the city of Lacey, fortunately. Next slide, please. Also, prohibits military equipment. Military equipment is really a term, nothing really to do with military or how you acquire it. It's just kind of, it's a category of things and tools and equipment. Unfortunately, they said no firearms larger than half a caliber, 0.5 caliber. And by doing that, that inadvertently prevented us from using less lethal shotguns, which basically puts out a beanbag, or a 40mm launcher, which puts out a non-lethal kinetic energy, kind of like it hit with a softball, and like a high fast pitch softball, right? But we can't use it because they're bigger than half an inch. Our lawyers and our insurance underwriter says you can't have those in the field. So that's a problem, because that gives us standoff distance and the ability to use a less lethal tool instead of a lethal alternative. The legislators, we've been talking to legislators, and I really appreciate Councilmember Greenstein in getting some of these meetings going. And they have frankly said, yeah, you're right. It's overly broad. We need to fix that in the next legislative session. So they have committed to looking at this and addressing it. So I appreciate that. Next slide, please. So House Bill 1310, moving to the next bill, talks about uses of force. And this is really interesting. So they said it revised the existing use of force statute to a new standard and talks about physical force. Unfortunately, the bill doesn't identify what physical force is. And that makes a big difference, right? What's physical force to one person isn't physical force to another. So we need to really have that identified. We also said that to protect against criminal conduct, there has to be probable cause to arrest. Okay, well, probable cause to arrest, a lot of times we'll be dealing with somebody where we might know the crime that we're investigating it. We're still under reasonable suspicion. That's all different now. We have to have probable cause that a crime has occurred and that a specific person has committed that crime before we can really start to take action against a specific individual. Statute talks about a duty of reasonable care, which we've always done. Authorizes, we can only use deadly force, only protect against an imminent threat of serious physical injury or death. Imminent means right now, not potentially, it means right now. And before we use any physical force, now this isn't deadly force, this is any physical force, we have to exhaust all available and appropriate de-escalation tactics prior to using physical force. Easier said than done, because what does exhaust mean? What does available mean? What does appropriate mean? I mean, it can mean different things. Those are all subjective terms. And when we asked the legislator to define the terms, they didn't. And when we asked them to use terms that are already been defined by the courts, again, they didn't use those terms. So again, it leaves us in a land of a lot of ambiguity. Wow, bad word there. Basically, it's kind of vague. We're trying to figure out what's going on. So we really have to be careful to make sure that we're only using force in certain situations. And I got to tell you, in the city of Lacey, we really use minimal amount of force, and we always have. So these laws are interesting, to say the least. So if you can go to the next slide, please. So we had to develop new policies rather quickly. So these laws were signed, and within 60 days, they went into effect unless there was a later date for just a very few of them. But the use of force and tactics started July 25th. So we had 60 days to look at our policies to make sure the policies were in line with the new legislation, and and make sure all our folks are trained up on those new policies. So we identified 22 threshold policies that these 16 laws addressed. And so we updated those policies. We put the language of the legislation into the policies themselves. Then we went and hired a legal firm to say, listen, test us. Is this the right way to go? They provide guidance. And frankly, if you look at our policy with the new template that was just put out by the WCIA, it's almost word to word to our policy. So we're pretty proud of that, frankly. In fact, WCIA said that the Lacey Police Department really captures the intent of the legislation in our policy. So we're pretty proud of that. In the bill, it says that the Attorney General's office has to come out with a model use of force policy, but they have a year until next July to do that. So in the meantime, we're really struggling as law enforcement to identify how we're going to respond to these calls, which is going to lead us to the next slide. Because really, what we did is, like I said, we identified 22 threshold policies. So what we did is we gathered all the chiefs in Thurston County and the sheriff and our support staff and our legal advisors and said, hey, what's our best approach to these laws? And frankly, our legal advisors and WCIA, our insurance underwriter, said, you guys really need to be careful how you respond from now on. You better make sure you're only going to crime-related calls. You really need to make sure that you're investigating a crime or you have a criminal predicate to be there or someone's in imminent threat of being seriously hurt in order for you to be there. If it's not a crime, you probably shouldn't be there. And that was really a concern for us because we've always been involved in caretaking here at the city of Lacey, and which is why we brought the mobile outreach team on board and frankly brought it on so quickly because they're going to help fill that gap where police officers really can't be there as much as we used to be. So it's pretty important. So obviously a lot of stuff goes into creating policy and a lot of stuff goes into training, and training doesn't stop. So we trained up all our officers to July 25th when we started, and every day something changes in the law. That's just the way the law is. And we make sure that we incorporate those changes into our daily and weekly and biweekly training so our officers get the most up-to-date information on how these new laws are being interpreted, and so we can apply them correctly. So can we go to the next slide, please? So moving forward, we talked about the mobile outreach teams, the use of counselors and clinicians and peer support personnel. We're really evaluating how we use our civilian employees to see if there's a bigger role that they can play since they're not fully commissioned law enforcement officers. Perhaps they can do more report writing and traffic investigation to free up our officers to do the crime-related stuff, actually arresting people, doing criminal, active criminal investigations, and really focusing on the more serious crime issues. Really looking at, we really needed to evaluate how we as a police department respond to these issues that are listed here: non-criminal matters, noise complaints, nuisance crimes and infractions, welfare checks, animal calls, suicidal subjects, medical calls, and when there's a reporting party or a victim for low-level offense and they don't want to prosecute. And there's lots of examples of all these things, but basically what it comes down to is there a crime occurring and for the police officer to investigate? Because in the law, it says if we arrive on a scene and there's no crime occurring or about to occur, we're supposed to leave. And I'm not sure folks are really going to be real happy with calling an officer to the scene and having them walk away when they realize that there's no crime. So what happens now, if we'll go to slide 10, is we have this flyer that we hand out at National Night Out and other events to let folks know how we're going to respond to crime moving forward. Remember, as I said, we have limited police resources to investigate crimes, so we really need to focus on crimes. And with the mandatory de-escalation that has to happen before physical force can occur, that means sometimes you bring a second officer to the scene. That means you use everything at your disposal not to use any type of force. And so that means an incident that used to take maybe 10 or 15 minutes can take 20 minutes, half an hour, even longer to resolve, which means you have less officer time to investigate more things. So obviously the calls we're still going to go to without fail: violent crimes, serious property crimes, domestic violence, no contact, anti-harassment court order violations, no problem, right there, no, without fail. On the calls we need to evaluate on a case-by-case basis, mental health, and when there's a designated crisis responder detainer call, there's no exception that allows us to use force on a mental health call to put somebody in restraints and take them on an involuntary hold. We asked for that carve out exception during the legislative session. It was not granted. That was an amendment that was offered. It was voted down. So really, we were only allowed to use force when there's a crime and we need to effect an arrest or prevent someone from getting hurt. That's kind of it. So if you have a suicidal subject that's only a danger to themselves, we're going to put them in touch on the phone with somebody who can help them. But there's a lot of legislative information out there that says the officers should not be involved in these type of calls. So either a mobile outreach team or designated crisis responder, depending on the level of the situation. But we assess every single call that comes in. So calls like noise complaints and civil disputes and nuisance crimes like loitering or public drunkenness, that kind of thing. Smoking marijuana in public, some park violations, some medical calls, overdoses, those kind of things, welfare checks, barking dogs, all that kind of stuff, right? So if it's a medical call, we're going to send medical resources there first instead of police officers. The old model was you call 911, whatever the issue was, a cop went, they figured out what was going on, they brought resources to the problem. The legislation says, no, we want a different model. We want the person to call in, report to dispatch. The call taker will take the information, summarize it, give it to a dispatcher, and then send it out. So if it's any of these kind of categories, the officer's generally going to call back the person who called in originally and see if they can get any additional information to see if there's a crime occurring that we would be needed to investigate. Otherwise, we're going to route that call to the more appropriate resource. And it might be neighborhood resolution services to handle a civil dispute. It might be to have a mod officer go out there and do outreach at a different time. It might be getting mental resources on the phone for that person, routing animal complaints to joint animal services. But it's really putting the right resource on that issue and making sure that officers are really just investigating crimes. And that's really trying to meet the intent of the legislation. Because if we show up and it's not a crime, we got to walk away. And I don't think that serves any purpose. And we want to make sure that we're giving people the best service. So in a nutshell, that's kind of it. We can take down the slideshow now.
Thank you so much, Chief.
So that was kind of really quickly going through the legislation.
No, that was a lot of really good information. Councilmember Greenstein or Miller, I want to give you an opportunity first just to ask questions that you might have or give your perspective or concern that you have personally of this legislation that has been added.
Wow.
How come you want to go first?
Sure.
I've got a few things I can add, but
well, first of all, I was thinking how much pressure or things had to happen for this to even roll downhill this far. So this is a big package, and it looks like a lot of people worked on it, and there was probably a ton of input. And oftentimes when you have, big packages and a ton of input, did they ask the right people? Who did they ask when they put a package like this together? And it's important that you ask, guys who it affects, officers on the street, attorneys, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and so on and so forth. In some of this stuff, I'm thinking they didn't ask the right people how this should look, how we should be responding to this. I work in an industry where the Federal Reserve does not necessarily ask us lowly loan officers how we feel about them buying up all the mortgage-backed securities. Until recently, 2020 finally asked us, what do you think we should do? At 2021, actually, when things start crumbling again, we told stop buying all the MBS. You're causing margin calls. And so in situations like this, it's important to ask those officers, what, and it doesn't look like that happened here. And then asking, having the highest elected official be the determining factor for a use of force is just, that's kind of ridiculous, in my opinion. In our case, that's the mayor, who is our. You don't want to have to call the mayor at 3 a.m. and say, "Hey, can we use a 40 millimeter launcher?" Or well, that's taken off the table completely. But I think some of this is going to have to be recrafted. And I think this feels, draft in form. And so, the no beanbag and no using of the de-escalation methods, I think they kind of missed the mark there, in that I don't think that was their intent. But with grand sweeping policy, you forget to drill down on some of the finer points. So I see some of this as having to be gone over again and recrafted in a way that's going to meet, the intent a little bit better, because I think they just kind of missed the mark on quite a bit of it.
So I'll jump in here and add a few things. I really do believe that the end goal is the same for everyone, the legislature, the police, our local electeds, all of us. The end goal, I think we all want good public safety. No one is looking for, expecting, and certainly not the police, are not looking to use more force than is necessary. But when you write legislation, it has to be clear. It can't use vague, ambiguous words. It has to be very clear so everyone knows what the rules are. So I think they need to do some work on that for starters. I can't imagine that they truly wanted to remove the less lethal weapons from police use. And it makes no sense at all that we would want our police to use their gun when they could have used a beanbag shotgun or the 40 millimeter, which allows them to subdue someone without causing serious injury or fatal injury in particular. I can't imagine that was really the legislative outcome they were looking for. But they made the big mistake, and it's like Councilmember Miller said, they didn't talk to the right people. They didn't want to hear from the police, and that's who they needed to listen to, at least partially. Now, I'm not saying the police should have called all the shots on these decisions, but they should have been at the table. I mean, you can't make policing legislation without police being at the table. So I think the legislature failed us pretty badly on that, and hopefully they'll fix some of that in the next session. The deal with the tear gas and the highest elected official of that jurisdiction. I mean, I know of a story that happened not too long ago that Chief could probably elaborate on more, but they had a situation where Lacey PD was there. We had the SWAT team there. So that meant you had an interjurisdictional SWAT team. So you had county there, and there were state police there. So, I mean, in a case like that, does that mean the governor has to approve it in order for the state police to be able to use tear gas? Do we really believe that the police should have to call the governor to get permission? The mayor and I actually and Lacey have discussed this, and he'll be the first to say, as the mayor of Lacey, he has absolutely zero training or any reason in the world that he should even be consulted on whether to use tear gas. That's a decision that'd be far better in the hands of our police chief, who's actually trained in this. So, I mean, I just think they dropped the ball in how it was done. I want to give them all the credit that I believe they were looking for the same outcome as we all want, right? Everyone wants de-escalation. I mean, there's been multiple examples over the past year. In fact, the chief gave out some citations, some presentations to a few of our officers for some of the great work they did in de-escalation this last year.
Yeah.
And not to be a complete homer, but I guess I will be a little bit. Truth is, if the state would have just adopted the way Lacey policing is done, we'd have great policing throughout the state, and they wouldn't have needed any of this additional legislation.
Yeah.
And I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I agree, Lenny. I mean, I just think that I agree. I think that their intention was good. I think everybody's end goal is the same. And I feel like they probably wrote that legislation, and once it got into the hands of the police departments who actually have to, adopt that, and, I mean, we're doing our due diligence to make sure that we are following that word for word. And then to see how that kind of plays out and the outcome of that, I have to think that they're probably just like, oh gosh, that was not our intent. Like, this was not really what the intention of putting this in place, but who knows? And like you guys have said, I mean, we'll see what the next legislation brings. Chief, do you feel like we're going to see some changes from this. I mean, this has really brought about some strong reactions from police departments across the state, from community members. Do you see that them kind of going back to the table and making changes to some of those additions that they made?
I think you've seen both from the legislators and from law enforcement and from community members and from council members and local leadership that there's a lot of refinement that needs to happen. The probable cause standard is a tough standard, and the example I use is you walk up, you see a guy, you see a wall, you see graffiti on the wall, you see a spray can on the ground, you see a guy standing there and he's got the color spray paint on his finger, and it's like, well, under the old system, you just detain that guy and then contact the owner of the business and figure out what's going on, see if he had permission to do it. You can't do that now. Now it's, I don't even know if I have a crime. So it's, sir, can you please stay here while I contact the owner of that wall to see if you had permission to tag the wall? And it's like, he doesn't have to, he can just walk away. There's nothing I can do to stop him. And, while I contact the owner, says, yeah, I didn't give anyone permission to tag my wall. Yeah, go get that guy. Well, he's gone now. I got to go find him. So that's going to be tough. So you have to identify. So the probable cause standard is pretty tough. That's why we had the reasonable suspicion standard. So you could conduct an investigation contemporaneous to what happened. So it's a different way of doing policing. It's very difficult. In reality, it sounds great in principle, but it's in reality, if you're a police officer, you realize you need reasonable suspicion. So you're able to conduct investigative stops. So that would really hope that they would address that. I think they will address definitely the less lethal tools and bring those back. And really all we need is one line saying this does not apply to less lethal munitions. And I think that would correct that easy enough. So I think there's a lot of work for refinement, like Councilmember was saying, Miller was saying, and Councilmember Greenstein was saying. It's that refinement. It takes time. The pendulum swings a little bit, and we realize that broad reaching legislation sometimes need to be nuanced a little bit because law enforcement is very nuanced at times.
Yeah. So Chief, you have been out in the community attending community meetings and business groups and rotaries, things like that, to try to share this information as much as possible with our community. What kind of reaction have you received? Has there been a common line of concerns and questions? Yes,
constructive gasp. I mean, the collective gasp of like, oh my gosh, you're kidding, right? And how did we get to here? And what can we do about this? And it's really about being engaged, right? You need to be engaged in the legislative process. Your legislators who you elect, really, you need to contact them and let them know your feelings on issues. And I think we agree. We don't want unnecessary uses of force. We don't want deadly uses of force when it's not appropriate. But we do want our officers able to protect themselves and the community. So we've got to find that happy spot, right? And it's a little self-serving, but I think the Lacey model works, right? We have a great history of de-escalation, of crisis intervention. We train our officers very well in those areas. We use tools as appropriate, and if we use force, it's the minimal amount of force necessary. It's proportional to what's going on. So I'm pretty pleased with how our officers are trained and how they respond. I think the public talks about that. And I think one of the biggest compliments we get here in Lacey is that a Lacey police officer is a member of the community who just happens to be wearing a uniform, right? So it's your neighbor, it's the guy you grew up with, it's a family member, and that's the great thing about Lacey. And that's why folks can't understand, well, what do you mean you can't come out and help me? You always come out and help me. I see you guys all the time. I know you're this and that. And so identifying the roles, well, it's not a crime. We can't come today. Until we kind of get some more wiggle room in the new legislation, it's being really conservatively interpreted because I can't let officers get decertified, because if they get decertified, they can't help anybody, right? So it's about really being careful and cautious in how we approach things and making sure we bring the right resource to the problem.
I think that I think we all kind of know and realize that this legislation wasn't directed at us, the city of Lacey. We just happen to be underneath the blanket of this thing. And we'll have to push up, through our city attorneys to say, hey, we need some clarification, some definition. I think this was aimed at, more the communities where you see an unarmed person lying in a pool of blood who did not have a weapon on them. I think that's where this stuff was aimed at, and we just happen to be in that path.
Yeah, Well, and I was just thinking, Chief, as you were, sharing your thoughts on that, it must be really hard for what to not be able to respond and be there for the community that they have become so connected to. What has the reaction been like from our officers? And
well, we take advantage of the opportunities that we have. So like National Night Out, we hit 10 different locations in the city. We had multiple teams of officers going out, and it was really just a great experience being out with community and talking about, hey, let's National Night Out is when we stand together as a community and say, hey, we're together and this is our town and we're going to really embrace that. And it gives us a chance to talk about the new legislation and talk about community safety and just engage as people, right? Especially after being in the pandemic, it was finally at a lull. We were able to get out a little bit and frankly, interact with folks and just have that good time. A little too much food for me, but that's good. That's right. Everyone should eat at every stop, right? So yeah, that's okay.
Meal at every stop.
So we couldn't do cops, cars, and kids this year. So we did summer cruising. So 3 Wednesdays in a row, we went to hit a third of the town each time with a car club, and we had high schoolers who dress up as superheroes, and we're going through the community, and we let them know where we're coming. We're Facebook Living. Officer Williams is a little hammy on there, but he's great. It's all fun. We stop and we give out tchotchkes to the kids, and we went through through Jubilee and handed out tchotchkes there, little stuff with just little trinkets to folks, and they love it. And you get to see people, and it was really about engaging with the community. You get to really highlight some of our new folks. We've been doing virtual ride-alongs with some of our new officers, and you're getting to see a lot of the diversity that we bring to the department that we attract here at Lacey. We're one of the most diverse departments in Thurston County, if not the region, and we're really getting a really full, vibrant community here at the Lacey Police Department, and we really like highlighting that. So our recruiting efforts, I think, are being very effective, and you're seeing a variety of officers, and it's not just variety of personalities, variety of life experience, and how they look at issues and problems, and so it's about getting that diversity of opinion and diversity of perspective. So that whenever anyone sees a cop, they can find that thing to identify with, right? To make it more personal. And we really want to be that personal police department.
Yeah.
One of the things I'm really proud of is I hear, as a council member, we hear from the residents on a fairly regular basis, right, Malcolm? You hear from people usually when they're complaining about something, but believe it or not, you hear a lot of positives too. And one of the strongest areas that I get positive feedback from our community is our police department. I hear from people on a regular basis how great the Lacey Police Department is, how professional they are, how courteous they are, how much they help, when people have direct interaction with them, how helpful they've been, how they feel, like the chief said, they feel like the police department in Lacey is part of our community. And, it shows. We have great community relations. We have, the SRO program is, I think, a phenomenal program that helps build that. I was sad that we couldn't do the, cops, cars, and kids. I think that event's been great. I've been out there every year. There's just so many different positive interactions with the police that I think it just makes a much better relationship and a stronger community.
Yeah, and the addition of the summer cruising, that was such a great alternative, and we've heard a lot of just really great feedback from that. The Facebook Lives that Officer Williams does he's great. He's just perfect for that. But the interaction and the engagement on social media through that was just really fun to see. So thank you guys and your team, Chief, for making that effort and getting out into the community and in a positive way, I think is really wonderful. Councilmember Miller, I wanted to give you an opportunity too. We're going to be wrapping up here in just a few minutes. The community engagement was a great way to end the conversation. I know we've gone through a lot of information, but Councilmember Miller, any final thoughts there?
Yeah, I'm really happy that Lacey Police take the time to engage with the community in kind of a friendly and I'm on my job kind of a way. If you were like a lot of people like myself, raised in a home where there was no weapons present whatsoever, seeing and being around somebody who has a weapon on their hip can make you really super nervous because, you know, you've never been around any weapons. And so, you know, to that engagement makes it feel like less of a threat for a lot of people. And I hope we continue doing that because I think it puts people at ease. I really do. And so I think that, you know, the city of Lacey just has a phenomenal record when it comes to de-escalation, when it comes to use of force. I think if I remember right, there hasn't been a weapon fired in 18 months, almost 2 years.
Oh, at least 2 years.
At least 2 years.
Since I've been here, that's for sure.
Yeah, not a weapon fired, which is, I'm not sure a lot of communities can say that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's just a great place to be, a great place to live, a very, you know, and I think that I know I appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.
I really do. I'm not, you know what I mean? I wouldn't be nervous around these guys, you know, being not holding a gun. I'm not a gun person. You know what I mean? I don't, but I'll be honest, you know, for a long time, being around gun people made me a very nervous individual, and I didn't like it because I didn't grow up around any of it, you know? And so, but here there's very much a peaceful feeling because partly because of the record that the city has, you know, being one of the top 100 cities in the country to live, de-escalation. I remember, I'll never forget the story about the guy at McDonald's,
Mm-hmm.
right? One of my favorites, you know, de-escalated that situation. He was like, oh yeah, I'll definitely go with you guys. Let's go.
Yeah.
Wherever, you know, to the holding cell, whatever. And I like that. I can't say enough about it.
Yeah, I know for me personally, it makes me really not only proud to work for the city of Lacey, but really proud to live in Lacey. I think Lacey's reputation has really improved and grown over the years, which is exciting. And it's fun I'm honored to be a part of, you know, working here and being a part of that change and seeing that happen. But really proud of our police department. Thank you, Chief, for all of the information. I'll be interested to see what this next legislative session brings. We might have to revisit this and have you back this time next year and give us an update on any changes that have come from that. So again, thank you guys for all of your time and this important information and your perspective. It is much appreciated. And for anybody watching, and if you've missed the conversation, please feel free to check out our Facebook page. You can also find it on our YouTube channel as well. So Chief and Councilmember Greenstein, Councilmember Miller, thank you guys so much. And we'll check in next time.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye now.
Bye.